And so, our last topic for this week, this collection of material, is ecosystem ecology. So, there's some other stuff that goes into this, but the big takeaway that I want you to get out of ecosystem ecology is understand this concept that I'm about to explain and understand why it's true. Okay. So I like to say energy flows and chemicals cycle. Okay. And so we're not going to get bogged down too much into the details of chemical cycling because, quite frankly, I find it boring. So we're not going to talk about it that much. We are going to talk about energy flow because that's a little bit more complicated and interesting, I think. And then you're going to use some of this information, a little bit, not a ton, but some of this to do another topic for ecosystem ecology, which is learning about biomes. And so you're going to be doing that on your own through an assignment that's going to happen in the future. Okay. So I'm not going to go over the biomes myself. I'm going to have you guys go over the biomes and teach each other about the biomes, which is going to be fantastic. Okay. So, yeah. Okay. So, energy flow and chemical cycling. All right. Um, Energy flows. So, what I mean by that is when you are looking at an ecosystem, right? Remember, so first of all, maybe we should back up and talk about what an ecosystem is. So, remember, community ecology deals with interactions between species. Okay. But ecosystem ecology is like bigger picture. So ecosystem ecology, we're often like spatially talking about bigger, so multiple communities within an area typically. And we're looking at topics about sort of like big picture, how does energy move through the organisms and their abiotic environment? How do chemicals move through the organisms and their abiotic environment? Okay. So that's kind of the gist of what we're going to be talking about with ecosystem ecology. So energy flows and chemicals cycle, I should say chemicals cycle. Okay. So here's the graphic that's in your book. I actually don't like this graphic as much as I like the next one because this, well, okay. So partly because they separate the two concepts, but I think the chemical energy thing is a little bit confusing. I don't know. We'll see. We'll see what you like better. I'll talk about both to see what you like better. So this particular graphic is talking about energy. The next graphic is the one that's talking about chemicals. Okay. Okay. So energy. The vast majority of the energy that is used by life on Earth originated in the sun. Okay. There are a couple of other very uncommon sources of energy. But really, the vast majority is from the sun. Okay. So energy enters our ecosystems as sunlight. Solar energy is converted into chemical energy by photosynthesis. So this is a process we haven't learned about yet, but we're going to. Okay. And that chemical energy is used by the organism that made it, and also anybody who eats it and anybody who eats them, so on and so forth. Another thing we're going to talk about is something called trophic structure. Okay, so that's coming up. A lot of that energy, though, is also lost anytime you transform energy from one kind to another. You lose some of it as heat. Okay, so we're going to talk about this like loss of heat and how energy flows quite a bit. Okay, chemical cycle. So I'm going to show you in the PowerPoint all of the different chemical cycles that it talks about in your book, but like I said, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about them because I don't care. But the idea is that chemicals are recycled over and over and over and over and over again in an ecosystem, right? They don't disappear, they don't go anywhere, right? They move where they're located, but they don't disappear. Okay. And so this particular example is looking at carbon dioxide, but specifically it's focusing on the carbon, right? And so there's carbon dioxide in the air, and that carbon dioxide, that source of carbon, is converted into sugar and other molecules by photosynthesis, which is used by the plant itself, right? And then converted back into carbon dioxide, or the sugars are consumed by a consumer, like our cow friend here. But then once again, they're broken down and released as carbon dioxide. So the number of atoms of carbon is constant, right? It's moving through this cycle. Okay. So this is what I mean by energy flows. It flows in one direction, but chemicals are cycled over and over and over again, right? So chemical cycling is on the next image. Okay, so what I like about this little diagram is it gives you an example. It shows this as like a closed system, because ultimately the Earth as a whole is a closed system, okay? So I kind of like that aspect of this. The other thing I like about this diagram is I like that you can very clearly visualize the flowing of energy, right? So energy flows from here to here, right? So from the sun originally, that energy is transformed into chemical energy. That chemical energy is used, right? And as it's used, it turns into heat energy. Okay. And so it is not a cycling, it is a flow, a unidirectional flow. Whereas chemicals are constantly cycling, whether it's carbon or oxygen or whatever, right? Any kind of element you could think of, right? That's used by life, right? Is cycling through here. Okay, so I kind of like this one better because it shows them both together. So to get it out of the way, let's talk about chemical cycling first. So, like I said, I really don't want you to learn the details of any of these because I just, quite frankly, I don't care, right? I think it's interesting if you're into that sort of thing, but whatever. Okay. But the idea is that this is kind of like a generalized chemical cycle where chemicals are found in various different living things. They also have an abiotic reservoir. So what does that mean, abiotic? Not alive. Usually there's some geologic processes involved, producers, consumers, decomposers. We'll talk about what all those terms mean in a little bit. Yeah, so this is like a generalized chemical cycle. And so you can look at the cycle of all different kinds of things throughout, biogeochemical cycles is what we call them together, right? So the cycling between living things and also the earth, biogeo. Okay, so here we're looking at the water cycle, right? So you learned about this when you were a kid. I know you did. I don't know what grade it was, but you learned about this. So this isn't super mysterious, I don't think. Okay. Anyway, learn more about it if you want to. But the idea is that water doesn't leave, right? We have the same amount of water. Where the water is found does change, though. So the biggest reason why we care about having clean water, right? The reason why we want to conserve water isn't so much that we're going to lose the water, but if it is in a form that we can't use it because it's salty, let's say, if it's in the ocean, or polluted, right, then it's not available for us to drink, right? So the reason why water conservation is important is not because the water, it's not because when it goes down the drain, it disappears. It's still here, right? It's just not as user friendly in that state. Okay, so that's why we care about water conservation. You can look at how phosphorus cycles through an ecosystem, through animals, through plants, through the soil. You can look at nitrogen as it cycles through. You can look at, what is this one? This one's talking about, sorry, I got stuff on the top. Oh, this is our carbon one, right? Carbon cycling through. Yeah. So you can learn all these different cycles if you're interested, but like I said, the main thing I want you to get out of this is just to realize that there's a cycling that's happening, right? So phosphorus doesn't go away. It just changes its form, right? Nitrogen doesn't go away. It just changes its form. Carbon doesn't go away. It just changes its form. Okay? It's a bobcat, by the way. A bobcat killed one of my chickens, so I'm not happy with bobcats right now. Bobcats are beautiful creatures, but yeah, we had a bobcat visit our yard. I'm not a fan. Anyway, okay. So that's chemical cycling. Done. That's all I'm going to say about it. Okay. Let's talk about thermodynamics. All right. So this is going to sound really technical and awful, but it's really not that bad. Okay. So there are two laws of thermodynamics, right? The first law, so you may have learned about this in chemistry or physics or somewhere else before. Okay. The first law, energy cannot be created nor destroyed. Okay, cool. Okay. But it can transform from one type to another, right? Okay, so that's what I'm going to say about that. Okay. Energy disperses spontaneously. That's the second law of thermodynamics. What does that mean? Energy transfers are not perfectly efficient. It becomes less ordered over time. If you've taken like chemistry or physics and they've talked about something called entropy, that's what the second law is about. You don't need to know that word entropy though. So like, if you're like, explain that to me, what is that? Don't worry about it. What I want you to get out of the most important sort of nugget from the second law of thermodynamics is this. Energy transfers are not perfectly efficient. So if energy is being transferred from a plant to an animal that eats that plant, it's not perfectly efficient. So 100% of the energy that was stored in the plant doesn't now get stored in the animal. A lot of that energy is used, and ultimately a lot of that energy is lost in it's lost. And when I say lost, doesn't mean destroyed. It's not destroyed. It's just in an unusable form. Typically that unusable form is heat. Okay. Right. So like I said, lost doesn't mean destroyed. It just means it becomes unusable. And so the result of 1 and 2 together is what I was saying before, right? Energy flows in one direction. So let's talk about energy for a sec, and then we'll talk about how energy flows and efficiency and all that stuff. So once again, I'm sure this is something you've learned before, when you were a munchkin, but just as, kind of a refresher. So in this diagram, they're talking to you about two different types of energy: potential energy, which is stored energy, and kinetic energy, which is energy of motion, typically. Okay. So here we've got a snowboarder. There is oh, my dog is doing something naughty. I'm going to go deal with him. I'll be right back. I just paused the share. I did not pause the recording. Linus is a naughty old beagle who had a neck injury a few years ago that was pretty significant and could have killed him. We don't know how he got it. We think he got it from jumping down something that was too high and like he, got a big like in his neck. I think he's got a slip disc or something. Anyway, he jumped into the bathtub to get into the trash. Jumping into the bathtub is never a good idea for him. Why do I keep the trash in the bathtub? Because otherwise he eats the trash. Cannot keep trash in my bathroom. Anyway, where were we? Okay, so up here at the top of the hill, our snowboarder has very high potential energy, because as soon as he stands up and orients his board correctly, what's going to happen? He's going to start moving down the hill, right? So he has very high potential energy, but he has no kinetic energy at the moment because he's not moving, right? As soon as he stands up and orients his board correctly, right, that stored energy, that potential energy is converted into kinetic energy. At the bottom of the hill, he has low potential energy because he can stand up all he wants and he's not going to move. Okay? He can convert kinetic energy, energy of motion, walking, dragging his sorry butt up the hill, right, into potential energy, right? So this is just this idea that energy can change forms, okay? But the important thing to realize about this is that when it transforms, it's never perfectly efficient. So all of this potential energy that exists, he's not getting every little bit of it out when he's moving down the hill because he loses some as heat, friction between himself and the air, friction between the snowboard and the snow, right? He loses some of that as heat. There is a little one sneaking in here.
Can you play this with me?
Maybe.
Aww.
Okay, I love you, Pickle. And I realized I was pausing the share on all of that. I'm totally not redoing this though. We'll see how bad it is when I read it, but when I check it, but I'm just gonna keep going. Anyway, I think what I said makes sense, even if you couldn't see the share. But now I'm recording and sharing and everything's good. And my daughter's not here, so that's also good. Okay. Similar, I'll let you look at this if you want to. Similar idea, but it's diving board. Other examples of kinetic energy and potential energy. So energy of motion or fire is kinetic energy too, right? Lots of potential energy in these examples. So all of this water, huge amount of stored potential energy, right? As it goes through the dam. Yeah, our skier, lots of potential. Anyway, kinetic potential energy, whatever. Okay, so like I was saying earlier, whenever you transform energy from one kind to another, that transformation is never perfectly efficient, right? So light energy that comes from the sun, that is not perfectly efficient, right? As it is captured in photosynthesis. Some of that energy is lost as heat, right? When you are running, you are using a type of potential energy called chemical energy, right? Breaking apart bonds in chemicals to release energy. Some of that energy is used as motion, but a lot of it is lost as heat. This is why she's so sweaty. I mean, it's probably hot outside too, but she's also getting hot because of this excess heat that's lost because of the transformation of energy from one kind to another. Okay. This is especially evident in a car, right? Okay. So here is we're going to talk more about energy when we talk about cellular respiration and photosynthesis. That's not going to be for a couple weeks, but we're going to get there. When we talk about energy, we're going to talk about the details of this a little bit more. But for now, okay, I'm interested in talking about the efficiency issue. Okay, so where do cars get energy? What is the source of energy for a car? Well, the source of energy is gasoline. At least we're talking about a gas engine. Okay, it's gasoline. Oxygen is necessary in order for combustion to occur. The oxygen is not the source of energy. The energy is the gasoline, but oxygen needs to be there. Okay, that process of combustion, of burning of the gasoline, is what gives us kinetic energy. But that kinetic energy, that transformation from chemical energy which is a type of potential energy, right? That chemical energy, that transformation from chemical energy to kinetic energy is not 100% efficient, And that's why engines get hot, right? This is why you need, you know, coolant in your car, right? This is why you have to be concerned if your vehicle overheats, because it literally will damage the engine. It gets so hot. The reason it gets so hot is because this transformation from chemical to movement is not efficient, right? In fact, the level of efficiency is pretty bad. It's like 40% efficient or something. It's pretty crappy. What you end up with, aside from that kinetic motion, right, that energy of motion, is you end up with a couple waste products, right? And so the waste products are carbon dioxide and water. And we'll talk more about the details of that a little bit later, okay? In our cells, a similar thing happens, but instead of combustion, we do cellular respiration, right? So once again, you have this really high energy molecule, food, and you need oxygen for it to happen. And that is converted into a type of energy that we use for cellular work called ATP. We're not going to talk much more about ATP at the moment. Just realize that's something, it has to do with energy. We'll talk more about it later. Okay. But once again, it's not perfectly efficient. There's some that's lost as heat. Okay. This is what I mean about efficiency. Okay. So food is our chemical energy, right? Food is where organisms get energy. Okay. This is important for what we're talking about because the next thing we're going to discuss is we're going to talk about food chains. Okay, so this is yet another thing that you learned about when you were a munchkin. I know you did. Okay, so let's define these different terms. So producers are organisms that do photosynthesis. Oh, I'm running out of space. Photosynthesis. What does that mean? They're called producers because they produce energy. But remember, energy isn't created or destroyed. So really what producers do, what photosynthesis is a process of taking solar energy and turning it into chemical energy. Okay, so that's what producers do. So who's a producer? Well, typically in a terrestrial, in a land food chain, it's plants. But in aquatic food chains, it can be a bunch of other things as well. It can be all kinds of creatures that exist in phytoplankton, algae, and diatoms, and all kinds of other interesting critters that we're not going to talk about too much. Okay. All right. So producers do photosynthesis. Okay. How about a consumer? What's a consumer? Consumers get their energy by eating producers. Consume producers. All right. Now, you will notice here we have several levels of being a consumer, What level you are at depends on what you eat. So another term that we often use to describe primary consumers is we often call them herbivores because they eat plants. Okay, so primary consumer and herbivore are basically the same thing. Another term that I should mention before we get too far is the terms autotroph and heterotroph, right? So an autotroph is another name for a producer, right? And an autotroph, the word autotroph literally means self-feeder. Right? Whereas consumers are also called heterotrophs. And as you know, hetero means other. So somebody is heterosexual if they're attracted to somebody of the opposite sex or the other sex, right? And troph means feeding, right? So heterotroph is other feeder. So you've been exploring various different organisms in Organism of the Week. And so you know that animals are heterotrophs, plants are autotrophs. The vast majority of the time, there's all kinds of weird exceptions. Or things that are kind of like borderline, right? But there it is, okay? So consumers are also called, oh, no, they're not, I consume. Producers, that was correct the first time I wrote it. Okay, so what do we call So what is a secondary consumer? A secondary consumer is a consumer who eats a primary consumer. So they're secondary. Okay. So not an herbivore. They don't eat plants. They eat animals. So we call them a carnivore. So you're not used to thinking of a mouse as a carnivore. But if they're eating bugs, they are, right? And then everybody above that is a carnivore too. Okay. Typically, we do not get higher than quaternary, give or take. And we'll talk about why in a minute. Okay. I have a diagram that's going to show you that. Okay. So we got a marine food chain on one side. We have a terrestrial food chain on the other side. Seems pretty straightforward. Okie dokie. Oh, I always want to forget these, and that's why I put this in here, because otherwise I'll forget them. Another really important part of a food chain that you can't see in the chain and is often left out of these is decomposers or detritivores. And so let's define those for a second, right? So I'm just going to write over here, food chain. Okay. All right. So let's talk about those for a minute. So detritivores are animals that eat dead stuff. Okay. Decomposers decompose, also consume, right? Dead stuff or waste. Those two terms are kind of interchangeable, but kind of not. So while a detritivore is a type of decomposer, detritivore is usually used in reference to animals, whereas like a fungus is a decomposer, but you wouldn't really call it a detritivore. So they're kind of interchangeable, kind of not, but they break down wastes, whether it's a dead body, right? Or, and when we talk about dead body, it's not all animal bodies, right? So like, where do the leaves go? When leaves fall out of the tree in the fall, where do the leaves go? They blow. No, they get stuck to a fence somewhere when it's windy. They ultimately get broken down by a decomposer of some kind or another, right? So mold, bacteria are great decomposers. All kinds of other fungi, all the bacteria, archaea are good decomposers too. And there are some animals that are decomposers. Like I said, we usually call them detritivores, but anyway, whatever. So there's some decomposers. There's some mushrooms growing out of a log, right? Decomposing that dead tree. Yeah. Anyway, okay. The thing about food chains is they're kind of a lie, right? So we teach about food chains, we learn about food chains, and it makes it all seem very orderly and tidy. But the fact of the matter is, and you know this, everybody eats more than one thing, right? So, consumers don't just eat one type of food typically, right? Some consumers are more dedicated to one dietary item than others, but they always, they have variety in their diet. So as it turns out, in reality, a lot of species play multiple roles in a food web. We call it a web instead of a chain because everything's all interconnected. Okay, so let's look at some examples. So here is our little rodent friend. Our little rodent friend, when he's eating that little seed pod, he's acting as a primary consumer because he is consuming a producer. But if he eats a grasshopper, then he is acting as a secondary consumer because he's eating the grasshopper, which is the primary consumer, which ate the plant. Yeah. So this is true for humans too. If you are vegan, what are you? If you're vegan, what are you? You're an herbivore or a primary consumer. What if you eat meat? Depends on what kind of meat you're eating, right? Most meat that humans eat are herbivores. We eat other herbivores typically. So usually a meat-eating human, right, a carnivore, is typically a secondary consumer. Although if you're eating weird exotic stuff, then it, you can end up higher up on the food chain. But there it is. Okay, so food webs are complicated, right? And because they're complicated, when things are missing from a food web, it can cause changes that you wouldn't necessarily expect. Okay, so food webs, sometimes when we talk about an ecosystem, we talk about the trophic structure, right? Trophic means feeding. So that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about different sort of feeding levels. Okay, notice the arrows. Which way are the arrows pointing? Well, in this case, up, but the arrows are always pointing in the direction that the energy is flowing. Because remember, what did we say about energy? It flows, it does not cycle, right? So it always flows. Yeah. Okay. So, right, these are, from other books that I'm showing you. They're cute little cartoony things. Here's the one from your book. Right. And so once again, they're showing you a, a marine example, and then they're showing you a terrestrial example. It's not that different. It has more words on it. Read it if you want to. Hey, man. Oh, shush. Trouble. Sorry. Oh, look, here's a food web. Okay. So what are we looking at here? All right. Well, seriously, Linus, mind your business. He smells that my husband is making dinner, and he always does this at dinner time. He's like, "Oh, somebody feed me. I'm a beagle. I need food." Okay. Producers, consumers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, quaternary consumers. Yeah. Okay. So once again, this doesn't show it very well, but there are, of course, animals in here that can be in multiple places in a food web, right? So just as an example, our red-winged blackbird, why is my pen not working now? I don't know why it's not. Oh, I wonder if I click. Let's see. There we go. Our red-winged blackbird is shown as a secondary consumer here because it's eating a caterpillar. But if it was eating seeds, it would be a primary consumer, right? So these things are always simplified because otherwise they would be way too much of a hot mess to, like if you put all the arrows in, it would be like a crazy hot mess. By the way, here's one thing that I find super charming about this. Look who's at the top here. Who's at the top? Who's at the top? A great horned owl who visited me in my yard last night. A great horned owl. It was awesome. I was like, I salute you, quaternary consumer, top predator, amazing creature. They eat foxes, y'all. They're like, great horned owls are, pretty badass. Just saying. And one came to my yard. I was super excited. My other dog, one of the puppies, started barking at it, and she just wouldn't shut up. And it was like, Raven, shut up. So finally we went outside, and the owls. Okay, I can't keep doing this with him barking, so I'm gonna have to pause. But anyway, great horned owls are cool, right? So you see how complicated this is. As a general rule, I try not to negotiate with terrorists, but I fed the beagle. Anyway, okay, so I think we're good there. All right, let's talk about energy, shall we? So I put in a bunch of graphics here because I didn't know which one for each of you is going to land the best. My favorite is actually this one. Okay, but we're going to look at a few different, but there's others to look at here if you right, if you can look around, right, and sort of see what works best for you to help you understand. Okay, so the idea is there's a thing called an energy pyramid. Okay, an energy pyramid is based off of the idea that energy flow is inefficient, right? So we talked about this idea that energy is lost as heat. 90% of it is used up once again. Remember, it's not destroyed, but it's used in cellular respiration, and it's ultimately lost as heat at every trophic level transfer. Okay, so of our primary producers, only 10% of the energy that's stored in a primary producer ends up in a primary consumer. And then only 10% of the energy that's in a primary consumer ends up inside of a secondary consumer. Okay, so this is a little pie chart version of this. Here's a little thing that kind of shows, all right, here's the breakdown, right? So units of energy are, at least in the US, the units that we use are calories. That's what we call them in food. We call them calories. Really what it is a measurement called a kilocalorie, but we usually just abbreviate it as calorie because we lazy. Okay. So for every 100 kilocalories our little caterpillar eats, right? A bunch of it is lost as poo, right? A bunch of it is converted to energy that the critter then uses to move around and do his processes. Only about 15 of those kilocalories out of the 100 end up in his biomass, end up a part of his body. Okay. So typically that transfer, about 90% of energy is lost in transfer. Okay. So this is giving you some examples of some numbers, right? To just kind of help you think about this. So for every 100,000 kilocalories of solar energy, you get 10,000 kilocalories of producers. Those 10,000 kilocalories of producers can produce 1,000 kilocalories of primary consumers. That 1,000 kilocalories of primary consumer can produce 100 kilocalories of secondary consumer. And those 100 kilocalories of secondary consumer can produce 10 calories of tertiary consumer. Okay, so okay, so that's on average, right? This explains why we often don't go above tertiary or quaternary consumers in a food chain or in a food web. Because the fact of the matter is, look at how many, to make 10 calories worth of snake, which by the way is this much snake, right? To make this much snake, it takes this much plants, right? That's what this is telling you essentially, right? So if we're talking about a quaternary consumer, let's say we're talking about my friend, the great horned owl. Okay, so I'm going to write owl up here. Okay, so 1 kilocalorie of owl. Okay, it takes a whole field of plants, right, to make enough energy to grow a grasshopper. And it takes a whole bunch of grasshoppers to feed a rodent. And it takes a whole bunch of rodents to feed a snake. And it takes more than a snake, more than one snake, many snakes over the lifetime of an owl. Do you get what I'm, do you get it? Does that make sense? Is that okay? Pick it up what I'm putting down? You smelling what I'm stepping in? Anyway. Okay. So this is the energy pyramid. That's what this is. Okay. And this is the reason, energy pyramid. This is the reason that we don't have quinternary. I don't even know what the word would be. This is why we don't have anything above quaternary consumers typically. Okay. Anyway. All right. We are part of the trophic structure of ecosystems, just like any other animal is. Okay. But one thing that's really interesting is that, you know, the energy pyramid applies to us, right? But the interesting thing is what you eat, right, has a big impact on how many resources you use. Okay. So on the left side, what are we looking at? We are looking at humans that are vegetarians. Okay. Right. So we're saying, just as an example, right? If you have 2 million calories of sunlight, that's going to grow 20,000 calories of plants. So they're showing you corn, but whatever. Excuse me, I fed you. Stop barking. Those 20,000 calories of plant can feed 10 people for one day, based on the average recommendation of 2,000 calories a day per person. Okay, so it takes 2 million. Linus, I'm serious. I'm gonna put you in your crate if you keep barking. This video is a hot mess. I just got him to shut up and now he's barking again. Okay, how much more do I have? Okay, I just have a little bit more, so we're just gonna ignore him and carry on, hopefully. So, this is one big problem with trying to do distance education, right? Is like, I don't have a soundproof booth. I don't have a recording studio. So every time you're getting anything from me, it's going to be with directions, because that's, that's how it is. It's ridiculous. Anyway, sorry. Let's get back to it. Okay, so when you are eating veggies, when you are being a vegetarian, for every 20,000 calories of plants, of corn, you can feed 10 of this guy. Arms crossed. Okay. All right. When you eat meat, you are higher up on the food chain, right? And so remember, because 90% is lost, right? What that means is that to feed only one person, right? Because he needs 2,000 calories a day. Yeah. Right? You need, I shouldn't do it that way. I should do it from the bottom up. Okay. So never mind. Just rewind in your head 10 seconds. So that same 2 million calories of sunlight produces the same 20,000 calories of plant material. That 20,000 calories of plant material produces 2,000 calories worth of beef, which is enough to feed one person instead of 10 people. Yeah. So let's talk about, diet for a second, sort of dietary choices, right? In the technical term, by the way, diet doesn't mean eating less. It just means what you eat, right? So technically speaking, diet just means what do you eat? It doesn't mean like, oh, I skip breakfast and for lunch I only eat, a salad. That's a different kind of diet. Okay. So scientifically speaking, diet just means what you eat. So diet has a pretty significant impact on our ecosystem, because how much land would you need to set aside to feed 10 of him if he's a meat eater? Right? Yeah? You need 10 times as much land to grow 10 times as much corn if you want to feed 10 people beef instead of feeding 10 people corn. Now, this is simplified, of course, because, we don't just eat, 2,000 calories of, cow or 2,000 calories of corn. We don't eat that way, right? We eat lots of different kinds of things. But the idea is that it takes way more resources, way more land, and also way more water, and way more chemicals like fertilizers and pesticides and all of those things, the higher up you are eating on the food chain, the more resources it takes, right? And so a lot of vegetarians or vegans are, choose that lifestyle for reasons because, they're concerned about, they don't want animals to die, right? So they're concerned about animal cruelty. That's one big reason. Another big reason is health reasons, right? Because having too much animal products in your diet can have negative health effects, right? If it's not balanced. So, a lot of people choose it for like health reasons. But another really important reason why somebody might choose to be a vegetarian, or at least to reduce meat in their diet, is an environmental one. Because if you eat meat, you are using way more resources to make your food, 10 times as many resources to make your food, right? Than you would be if you were eating veggies. Okay. So just something to think about, right? So how does, I constantly am talking about how, you use biology every day in your life, right? And so, even what you eat has environmental impact, right? Affects ecosystems. Anyway. Okay. All right. One last thing related to food, related to energy pyramids, because while this is fresh in your mind, I want to talk about this last thing, even though it's about something different. But while you still have the pyramid in your mind, I want to talk about it. So something called biological magnification. So biological magnification is the phenomenon where some types of chemicals have a tendency to become more concentrated as they go through the food chain. Okay. This does not happen with all chemicals. It only happens with things that persist in tissues, that stick around and they don't break down. Okay. So the like classic example of biological magnification is a pesticide called DDT. DDT is an incredibly effective pesticide that is used a lot around water to kill mosquitoes, right? And so it actually is a really important tool that can be used to control mosquito populations in places that where malaria is a problem, or other mosquito-borne illnesses are a major, major health problem. Here in the US, for the most part, we don't have to worry about that. So in the US, we did use DDT for a while until we learned about the long-term effects of DDT. And now it's banned in the US, right? Which is fair, because I think there are other pesticides that we can use that are a little bit safer. Here's the problem with DDT. DDT does not break down in the environment. Okay. So even if there are very small quantities of DDT in the water, so that's 0.000003 parts per million, the little microbial, not microbial, but really small microscopic plankton, right, that eat it, it builds up in their tissues because they spend their lives living in this water. So it builds up to 0.04 parts per million. All right. Well, because of the energy pyramid that we just looked at, we know that in order for fish to be a certain size, they need to eat a lot of plankton. So that 0.004 becomes 0.5 parts per million, right? And in order for a big fish to survive, it needs to eat a lot of little fish, which, by the way, means they ate a ton of plankton because of that energy pyramid, right? And now we're up to 2 parts per million. So it's getting more and more concentrated. Yeah. And then by the time we get to top predators like our osprey, I'm assuming this is supposed to be an osprey. I don't know. A fish eating bird. Eagles eat fish too. 25 parts per million. The reason that people got so worked up about DDT is that we started seeing a lot of numbers, a lot of populations of birds being really negatively affected. The one that gets the most attention are bald eagles because they're our national bird. Bald eagles eat fish, and they eat large fish, right? And so when DDT was being used in the US, we found that the population of eagles was going way down. And the reason it was going down is because of biological magnification, because there was so much DDT in their body tissues. It was causing their eggs to have really thin shells. And so mama eagle is sitting on the nest, and instead of the shells being strong enough to protect the eggs, right, she was breaking her eggs just by sitting on them because they were so thin. And so they banned DDT, and now eagles are doing great. They're much better off than they were because they can sit on their eggs again without breaking them. Okay, so that's DDT. We see this, like I said, not in all chemicals, but we see this in a lot of chemicals. So another example is mercury. So one of the reasons why certain fish, you want to be careful about how much you consume is because mercury doesn't break down, right? So mercury also is subject to biological magnification. So if you eat a fish that is a top predator, that's kind of up at the tippy top of the energy pyramid, it's going to have a lot more mercury in its tissues than if you're eating lower down in the food pyramid, right? So in this example, they're talking about mercury. So first of all, how does mercury get into the water? Well, mercury is one of the things that is released in coal burning, right? Releases a lot of mercury into the air. And anything that's in the air ends up in the oceans. And so, small amounts of mercury end up in the ocean, but because of biological magnification, right, it gets into the plankton, and then the plankton get into the little fish, and then it gets into the bigger fish like the mackerel, and then it gets into the biggest fish like marlin and tuna and all of these like top predators. And that's why there's certain fish that they tell you, you shouldn't eat when you're pregnant. Even if you're healthy, you shouldn't eat too much because too much mercury in your diet is a problem. Any mercury is not good, but if you end up with a lot of mercury because of what you're eating, right, that can be a problem. So that's another example of biological magnification. Okay, that's where we're going to cut this off. So next is going to be human impacts, right? So now we're taking everything we've talked about in population ecology, community ecology, and ecosystem ecology, and we're kind of talking about what role humans play in all of that, right? And not just the bad things that we do, but also what we can do to repair some of the harm that we occasionally produce. Okay, so that's where we're going next. All right, there's a little summary if you want to look at it. Flow, energy flow, chemical cycling, whatever. Anyway, that's it for today. Okay.